Hello, and thanks for making the Parable Podcast a part of your day. I'm Danielle Zapchenk, and you are in for a treat with Aubray Scott. She is such an authentic, real gem of a person, and she kept me laughing the whole time. Just a quick note, Aubray briefly shares about sexual abuse and rape, so if you have little ears with you, or if that is triggering for you, just please fast forward. I have a marker in the show notes of where that would be. You know, even in the hard parts of her life, God showed up and he provided a beautiful parable story.
I was raised in the church. I had incredible Christian parents. I ended up dating the wrong guy. I went off the deep end. I was the black sheep of the family, the prodigal. I worked in the sex industry. I have lots of crazy stories in and between that. And when I finally walked out of that industry, I walked into a church and I was turned away. So I really I was like, these people with their hands up in the air praising don't even notice me. I weighed 85 pounds. I'm 5'8". I look like death. And I was literally dying from the inside out. I hated Christians. I despised Christians after that. I was like, if that's what love is, I don't want it.
Please enjoy this conversation with Aubray Scott. We have Aubray Scott with us. Aubray, tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do? What are you about?
So basically, I have been an international missionary for the past 10 years. I've lived outside of America. I've lived in Asia, Africa, and Europe, traveled and done many different things. Anything from working with people coming out of the sex industry, gangsterism, drug addiction, orphans, you name it. When God has called me to a place, I just go, and it looks a little unpredictable and almost inconsistent, not like the typical missionary. But if you know anything about Jesus, he ain't always typical, and I'm definitely not typical. So that's kind of what I've been doing, and how I've been able to do that is something that is not also, normal. I'm not funded by a church or a ministry, an organization. I'm fully self-funded, and I purchased a house in Texas in 2016, renovated that, turned that into a short-term rental property, Airbnb, VRBO, and then was able to live off of that. I wasn't living high on the hog, not 5-star living, not first class, but God has been able to bless me through that. And then he opened other doors for me to be able to use my hands or my voice or whatever to make money. And so a big part of my story is just provision in that. And so that's kind of what the past 10 years has looked like for me.
Has the idea of mission work something that was at the forefront of your mind growing up? Like, is that something that was impressed upon your heart? Or did that just kind of come out of, I want to travel, I want to see the world? How did that start?
So when I was in the 6th grade, I wrote in my little diary that I wanted to travel the world, help people, and bring music to the world. And I always was drawn to like China, South Korea, Africa, and so it was that little thing when I was a child. And a big part of my story is like, I was raised in the church. I had incredible Christian parents. I ended up dating the wrong guy. I went off the deep end. I was the black sheep of the family, the prodigal. I worked in the sex industry. I have lots of crazy stories in and between that. And when I finally walked out of that industry, I walked into a church and I was turned away. And I was like, these people with their hands up in the air praising don't even notice me. I weighed 85 pounds. I'm 5'8". I look like death. And I was literally dying from the inside out. And I think it's such a story because I hated Christians. I despised Christians after that. I was like, if that's what love is, I don't want it, because that's not love to me. And I can do better without tying a religion to it. And so from there, I moved to China, and God did a crazy work in me. I studied every religion. Allah, you real, Buddha, you real, crickets, crickets, crickets. And then I was like, okay, Jesus, God of unconditional love, very sarcastically. And it was there in China that God just completely transformed and redeemed my entire life and my story and the shame that I had, swept under the rug as a child because I was sexually abused as a child. Like, so many things just came to the surface. And then it brought me back to, he was like, hey, you hate Christians, but that is going to be a people group that I've called you to, because the lost isn't just the unsaved. It's also the church folk who they haven't really got it. There's not a head-to-heart connection. They've missed the mark. They don't know what my love actually is or what it entails to walk it out. And also just, I had put these people on a pedestal expecting them to be different, but you can't expect perfection from the imperfect. And we're messy people and we have messy stories and we come from different upbringings and backgrounds and experiences. And so he was just like, your life is going to be something that you're going to bring church to people who wouldn't experience it otherwise. And that can happen in a bar, at a picnic, over a cup of coffee and a piece of toast. It can happen anywhere, at any time where two or more are gathered, I am there. And so that's kind of like where I was launched and catapulted in China. And this was in 2011.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that and just being honest and vulnerable, especially in those experiences where we have people in our lives that are Christian. And that's what becomes our framework of what Jesus is, when really Jesus is the framework. And that's what we have to really focus on first. And like you said, we're all imperfect, and just recognizing that, because then it just gives us just a little bit of relief that we're not trying to measure up to these people. We're measuring up and trying to have that relationship with Jesus first and foremost. So take me back to what happened in China that God captured you after searching through all of those other religions and trying to find some answers. What happened in that moment?
Actually, something even more tragic happened, because you know how it is. Most of us find Jesus in the rock bottom moments, and finally I was just like, okay, I gotta do my dream. I gotta travel the world, help people, and do music. Well, I wasn't singing or doing music at all, and I couldn't help people because I couldn't help myself. So that's why I traveled to China. And I'm in China. I open a Bible, and I don't even know. I don't think I even took a Bible. I think I somehow found one, which in China, ain't easy. And I did that whole thing where you're like, God, if you're real, show me. And I pointed at some Bible verse, and I can't even tell you what it was, but whatever it was a divine thing for me in that moment. And I was like, okay. I went to a church that week, and it was an underground church. And the next week I was like, okay, I'm going to actually go to a church, and I couldn't go because of my schedule. And that weekend, 250 people were arrested from that church. And I was just like, okay, I can't even go to church. So what am I going to do? And the Lord was like, it's not time for you to be placed in a church. Church is going to happen with me and you, because there's a work that I need to do in your life and some healing that needs to occur before I can ever put you around people. And so that's kind of where that started. And in the midst of this, I ended up getting raped in China. I walked through sexual abuse as a child and other things, and I'm not somebody who, I don't want to look like a victim. So I didn't want to tell anybody, because I didn't want people to pity me. I didn't want people to be like, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. That's not how I operate. And so I didn't want to let anybody know. But at the same time, that seed of shame was put in my life. And that's the number one tactic of the enemy. We see it in the Garden of Eden, shame. They covered themselves. We see it with the woman with the bleeding disorder. She did it, she showed up in the midst of a crowd and grabbed his cloak, because shame keeps you in a place where you try to hide. And so I was just like, I got to keep this hidden, but also simultaneously, I don't want anybody to have a pity party for me. And in that, I remember just being like, I felt nothing at all. It was like I didn't even care that it happened. And I realized I thought that the rock bottom was in the sex industry, where I was exploited, where the man that I loved encouraged me to maintain the cell. He was more of a pimp than a prince, where I was the prodigal. But the rock bottom was actually in China, where I ended up not even fighting what was happening, because I remember hearing this lie, like, you're not worth fighting for anyways, Aubray. And I believed it. When I felt nothing, that was where I realized this is my rock bottom, because to feel nothing is a very dangerous place to be. And so I remember just crying out to the Lord, and I was like, why did you allow this to happen? Because even though I worked in the sex industry, I was like, there's God's hand over that. I never had sex with anybody. It was like I was hidden in plain sight. I worked in that industry. I made lots of money, but I was the most covered girl that you'd walk in there and see. Somehow I got away with it. So I wasn't out here just really selling myself. It was like I was a pretender even in that. And so for me to be raped, that was really hard, because even with the guy who abused me, I never had sex with him. And so I was a virgin when that happened. And so I was just like, God, like, you're supposed to be a God of unconditional love. And I was sexually abused as a child. I was raped as a virgin. And I did a lot of things that I shouldn't have done. I worked in an industry that exploits people, and I chose that. I chose a lot of things. So I know that it's not just everybody else. It's also me. But I just had a lot of questions as to why. And that's when God just told me, look, like you had fallen long before you acknowledged the fall, and I carried you. And this thing that's happened to you, I'm going to carry you too. And there's going to be people on the other side of this story that your story is going to help me carry them, because it's going to remind them that they're not alone and that shame doesn't deserve a spot at their table, especially in their soul and spirit. And that I can use all of these things that are gross and disgusting and despicable and hard and yucky. I can use them for something good if you trust me and you allow me to do that. And so that's kind of what the beginning of my really walk with the Lord looked like, was this just messy pile of junk and garbage that I was just like, he ain't gonna turn this into anything. And now 10 years later, I can truly say, I'm like, whoa, it's a masterpiece. And every day is a journey. You know, I don't believe that there's an arrival point with the Lord. We're not arriving on earth. Every day is a lesson learned. And then you have more things to face and more trials and more hardships and more pain and more loss and all the things. But I think because I was willing to just give over everything to him and be like, okay, if you can use this, by all means, like, I can't do anything with it. I don't even know what this is. And the past 10 years have just been reconciliation, restoration, redemption, refinement, and really facing the fire and letting him turn something that I thought was disgusting and that I didn't want anybody to see or to pity me for into something that's purposeful. And I just think that that's how he uses all of our stories.
That's true, that when we hear those lies and those shame, it like brings us down and we close ourselves off from being able to share that with other people, because we're told, oh, you know, that's horrible, that's disgusting, and we shouldn't share that with anyone else. But in reality, God wants to break open that messiness. And that's when that relatability comes in, and we understand we are human. We have made mistakes. There are things that have been done to us that was in no way our control. And he is going to use that. And that kind of reminds me, I don't know, have you ever heard of kintsugi? It is, I think it's a Japanese art of pottery.
Oh, yeah.
They take the cracks in of these jars, and usually we're like, oh, I'm going to throw that away, but they fill it in with gold. And it becomes special and it becomes priceless in a sense, because now those cracks that we want to hide and we want to cover up now are highlighted, and God says, I'm going to use that, and you are perfect even in the messiness. So thank you for sharing that. In the idea of sharing those stories, what else has been something impactful that you've recognized and you can see God's hand on these lessons that he's been teaching you over your life?
Basically, the past 10 years has been all about God's provision and his faithfulness in that. And what did it require of me? It required obedience. That was it. I just had to go when he said to go and, do things when he told me to do them. And in that, I've just gotten to see the sweetness of his provision. And one of the stories that I just wanted to share, it was in 2017, but it just really deeply impacted me. I was actually moving to Bali, Indonesia. So I had gone there on a trip. It was fully paid for by a travel company. I didn't even know why they asked me to go. I wasn't an influencer or anything like that. I didn't make videos, didn't have a blog. I just shared crazy things about my life on social media. And so they were like, yeah, we want you to go. And so I go. And I'm there for 2 months, and every conversation I have with people there, they were like, well, if that's what's true about Jesus, and I believe that, but I've never heard a Christian say that before. And we always hear, the harvest is plentiful, but the harvesters are few. And the Lord really put that on my heart for Bali, Indonesia. And I was like, Lord, I don't want to do Asia again. I've done my time in Asia. I spent a lot of time over there. And he was like, do you trust me? And I was like, yeah, I trust you. So, but sometimes I'll argue with him for 2 weeks, I'm like, I don't want to do it. But at the end of the day, I already know if he told me to go, I'm going to go. But for some reason, I always still do that. I argue. So argue for a couple weeks. And then I'm like, okay, Lord, I'm going to go. And at this time, I had already started renovating the property that I owned in Texas. And honestly, I was excited because I was like, I'm going to live here in this house, you know? And that whole story of how I even got a property is kind of another story of God's provision and faithfulness. I hadn't worked in America in years. I was working like 3 jobs, cleaning houses full time, doing social media part time for a company. And I helped co-found a nonprofit for special needs adults. And we were launching that and getting that off the ground. So I wasn't making any money really. And on paper, I definitely couldn't get approved for anything. And the company that I was doing social media for ended up hiring me full time to do marketing. And that's how I ended up getting approved for any kind of loan in America. And I'm really big on specific prayers. So I wanted to be in this certain neighborhood. I drove circles around it in my car, prayed over this neighborhood, looked at 90 houses over a 9-month period of time, put an offer on a house outside of that neighborhood, ended up getting really discouraged. I was like, okay, Lord, like I've been here back in America for 9 months and I can't be shacking up with my parents. You know, I love them, but don't want to be their roommates. If you don't have a house for me in the next 2 months, I'm leaving and going somewhere else because I don't want to be here anyways. And that probably sounds a little bratty too, but I think because of the posture of my heart, I just really trusted that he had something for me, and I put in the work and nothing was happening. And, you know, we could put in the work all day long, but if it's not God's timing, and I think just simultaneously with that sometimes for me, I had to draw my line in the sand and be like, Lord, like, you know what I want, and I want you to do it in this time because it's been a whole year. And so I prayed very specifically. I want a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, trees, because we don't got trees where I live in Texas and North Texas. I want a big garage and a big closet because I've been living out of a backpack. I was very specific. And I want hardwood floors. It can be an old house with character. Anyways, I looked at all these houses. Nothing happened. And I ended up telling my realtor, I'm not looking at any more houses. I'm done. Thank you so much for showing me the 100 houses. I'm sorry. You're amazing. I'm not looking anymore. And prayed that prayer to the Lord. And it really wasn't a place of like pride or arrogance or even like having a bad attitude. It was literally like, you know my heart, and here's my line in the sand. And that week I ended up going to a flea market, and this woman had all this cool furniture, and I was just like, I love your furniture. And she said, oh, you should buy it. And I said, I can't, I don't even have a house. And she's like, oh, I have a house. And I was like, not interested. And she's like, it's in Brook Village. Brook Village is the exact neighborhood that I wanted to be in. And I was like, no, I looked at taxes over there. It's $300 a month. And in this hillbilly town, that's expensive. So I ain't gonna pay that. And she's like, oh, so she gets on the phone, calls her daughter, and she's like, hey, can you look up the taxes? $120 a month. And I was like, still not really. And she was like, just go look at it and I'll come over after the flea market if you want to see it. So I drive over and I'm like, it's okay, you know? I walk in. I mean, it's kind of like Stevie Wonder did the ceilings. The texture's crazy. None of it matches. There's stop sign, red, paint everywhere. But I knew in my spirit it was my house. I had complete peace, and I just knew without a shadow of a doubt that it was mine. And I'm like, yeah, I know it's my house. And she's like, actually, it's not even for sale. I was like, how are you going to show me a house that ain't even for sale? And she's like, well, my dad is 85 years old. He's had the house for 50 years. He was actually the one trying to renovate it. Let me just give him a call. So she calls her dad. 2 weeks later, I meet with him. I make a vocal offer with him. We sign a piece of paper. I give him a $1,200 escrow check. And I end up closing on this house. It is 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, all hardwood floors, 3 pecan trees in the backyard, a massive garage, a giant closet, and it's on Victory Avenue. And if God is not in the details, then I don't know where he's at, you know? And so it's crazy because I wanted to share that specifically because I was so excited about this house and having people in my house. I always have my door open. I have potlucks all the time. All kinds of people show up in my house because I'm around all kinds of people. And at the same time, I always wanted to live abroad and travel internationally. And God was like, I'm going to bring them to you. And within the first year of me owning that house, somebody from every single continent had already showed up in my house. And so 4 months later, when I go to Indonesia and God's like, are you going to move here? I was like, I have my house and I'm cultivating this atmosphere in this space. And, you know, I'm trying to get rooted. And he was like, do you trust me? And I was like, I trust you, but I like it. I haven't been here very long. And he was like, but you trust me, right? Because I have something even better. And so I went to Indonesia for 2 months. And over the next 7 months, I ended up finishing the renovation on this house. And when I moved to Indonesia, but I only had like one person Airbnb and stay in my house at a time while I was here. And I didn't have anybody staying in my house. And I had never really Airbnb'd in that way, especially not physically being on the property. And so I was just praying like, Lord, I can't pay a mortgage here, my insurance, all these things, and pay to live somewhere else. You're going to have to make this happen. He gave me a date to leave, and it was within a week, and I had nobody staying in my house. And I said, please, by Tuesday, because this was a Sunday, I was leaving the next Sunday. I was like, by Tuesday, let at least 2 people stay in my house. And by Tuesday, 3 people had committed to staying for 3 months and 1 for 6 months. And the one who was going to stay for 6 months was like, I clean houses full time. How about you just let me clean and manage the property and take it out of my rent? I immediately had an on-site, basically, manager. And when I ended up in Bali, the Lord's like, do you see like your faithfulness and your obedience to draw the line in the sand and to buy this house, even though you didn't want to be rooted in America? It is the very thing that's providing for you in Bali, Indonesia. And not just that, but like that week before I left America as well, I ended up from Instagram. I met this guy, met him in California. I created a coffee brand. That's also something that I did in my downtime in America while I was doing all these other things. And I had gone to a coffee festival and I let him in on a VIP pass. And so he messaged me and he was like, hey, I'm in Dallas and I want you to come to this Christian conference. And I was like, I don't know about that. Like I was fine with Christians now. We're good. It's been like almost 8 years of following Jesus, but I wasn't into the Christian conferences. I was rooted in a local church, but I didn't know really what that looked like. And he was like, you should come. I know you should come. So he gives me this free ticket for this 3-day conference. And I show up to this conference. I don't know anybody. And I'm in VIP, which I didn't even know what that meant. And I didn't know the people that were sitting next to me. But, when somebody turns around and is like, oh, Christine Kane is 3 rows down. And I'm like, I don't know who that is. But that's cool. So anyways, I'm just sitting by all these people that we're kind of scattered in the VIP section. And some girls had snuck into the VIP section because this conference was packed. And so they're like, we talk to each other, but none of us know each other. And so they had kind of said, oh, what do you do? And I was like, well, I'm not defined by what I do. I'm just following Jesus and I'm about to move to Indonesia. And they're like, what? That's crazy. And I'm like, yeah, my life's crazy. It's a wild goose chase following Jesus. So that's about it. And then Christine Kane gets on the stage and she's talking about the A21 campaign. And if you want to donate, we're passing around the buckets. And I was thinking to myself, like, I'm not putting any money in that bucket. Like, I'm an international missionary myself. I don't even, kind of having this little thing with God. And he's like, I want you to put all of your money in the bucket. I was like, say what? I was like, is that the devil or is that Jesus? Because I need to make sure. And I hear him again. He's like, you need to put it all in the bucket. And I was like, God, like, my heart. And I don't have a lot of money. And I bought this house and I don't even have people staying in it because at this point, nobody was staying in my house. And I have $400 in my purse right now. 200 was American USD and 200 had already been converted to Indonesian money so that as soon as I got off the plane, I had my taxi money and all that. And he's like, do you trust me? And I was just like, I trust you, Lord. And I was like, okay, I'll put the 200 in USD. Like, they can't use this rupee over here in America. And he said, I asked you to put all your money into the bucket. And I'm like, ooh, like my heart is pounding. My hands are sweaty, like I'm freaking out. And I see that bucket getting closer. It's dark in the room, but I see it. And I'm just like, Lord. And he's like, do you trust me? And I'm like, yes, I trust you. And I feel like a tear came out of my eye because I was so scared. But at the same time, I just had peace and I knew that he was going to provide because he always has. And so in that moment, I pick up my purse on the ground and I pull out my wallet and I feel somebody grab me. And again, we're spread out. So there isn't anybody really near you. And I feel this hand on my arm and I look over and it's this girl and she's like, hey, I have something to tell you. And I was like, she about to give me a prophetic word. Like, you gonna Jesus juke me right now? Cause I'm having a moment. And so I'm expecting her to say something, and she's like, the Lord just told me to give you $1,000. And I was like, what? And so I tell her what had just happened and transpired between me and the Lord. And I had my wallet in my hand And she's like, it's so crazy because I'm not even from Dallas, because this happened in Dallas, Texas. She's like, I'm from DC. I go to every conference, Christian conference that I can go to. And she's like, since January, I've had this $1,000. So every time I go to a conference, church, I ask the Lord, do I give it now? Do I give it now? Do I give it now? And the Lord's like, no, wait. And today he said, give it. And she thought to herself, oh, you want me to give Christine Kane? Like she already got lots of money, you know? And he said, no, I want you to go give it to that girl that's going to Bali, because she had overheard me talking about it. And so immediately, the very moment that I was obedient to give everything that I had, God gave me a double portion. He gave me more. And so I have a photo of me putting all my money into this bucket, and then the screenshot of her Venmoing me at 8:22 p.m. $1,000. And I think that that's just kind of what following Jesus really looks like. It requires obedience and trust and faithfulness. And it requires us to put all of ourselves into that bucket, whether it's your finances, your gifts, your abilities, your talents, your time. You have to put all of it in, but he gives you even more than you could imagine. He does exceedingly abundantly more. And sometimes we forget the more, but that is the more that God has for us. And that is kind of obedience. It's just that sweet spot where it's not, I have to do it. It's, I get to do it. And that's the posture of your heart that is kind of changed and pivoted in a way where my default, if God tells me to do something, I know something good is going to be on the other side of it. Maybe not for me, but it's always for me too. It's a both and, because when we're faithful to give something or to say a word to somebody in the grocery store, to turn our car around and go back and do that thing that God told us to do, even though it sounds crazy, it blesses that other person on the other side of it, but it also blesses us as well. And so that's just one of the many stories that I have over the past 10 years of following the Lord, and how his provision, he does have abundance for us. And that doesn't mean that we won't suffer, or that there won't be hard times, or that we won't need to lean into him and trust that food will show up. You know, there were many seasons where I didn't even have food, and I would be like, Lord, I'm living off of $80 a month. I don't know how I'm going to make it. And somebody would show up and be like, hey, I got you some fried chicken. The Lord just told me to show up. And I was like, you know, I love some fried chicken. So God didn't just give me normal grilled chicken. He gave me the fried chicken. And so it's things like that where it doesn't mean that it's not hard, because I wouldn't want to ever sugarcoat it and say that my life is perfect. I'm definitely not the highlight reels on social media. I love to share the lowlights too, because that's where God's goodness is. And that's where we have this nearness with him. And also just like Jesus reclined at the table, there's an intimacy when you lean in and you're literally reclining with him, and you just have to trust him. And so I think that that is kind of a big part of my parable story, and just the provision, but also the faithfulness and obedience, and the fruit of obedience is always provision. And it's so, so sweet to experience.
Amen. I felt you just preached to me right there. And you did. Thank you for sharing that, because I think you're right with that sense of obedience. It's hard. It's so hard, because our human nature is like, well, but this is what we're supposed to be doing. And it's also, you're talking to a God that, you can't physically see, and just be like, let's, set up a date so we can talk details. I wish, right? But also at the same time, it makes me think about, Abraham in the Bible. Like, God promised him that he was going to be the father of all these people and generations. But yet when he finally had his son, God's like, I need you to sacrifice him. And you're like, wait, are you sure? Did I hear that correctly? And while that seems so crazy to us, he wants to see what you talked about, that obedience. And that obedience is hard. And so I appreciate you for sharing that. If somebody is walking through a time of questioning and they're wondering, like, what does obedience look like? How would you encourage them to seek that out?
I would say for me, it's not this grandiose, crazy, extravagant thing. It is moment by moment. It's the little things, because the little things become the big things. And so if you're obedient with the few things that God gives you, God calls us to love our neighbors, right? Well, do you know the names of your neighbors? Because that's kind of like what obedience looks like, is who's around you? What are you doing? Are you loving people well? Because Jesus was the epitome of love. Like, he opened up his arms were stretched out wide, and he died on the cross for all of us. And so many times it requires us to die to ourselves. And so you have to, just like in scripture, it says obedience trumps sacrifice. A lot of times we think, oh, I'm going to sacrifice all these things. But obedience is in the day to day. It's in the moment by moment. It's in the little bitty things that may seem minute or insignificant. It's, when you're sad and depressed, because I've been fetal position wanting to die and sat in that, and it's okay to sit in that and to let the Lord love you and to heal. But there is a time and a place when the Lord's like, it's time to get up and start moving. And sometimes that's not always easy, but being obedient, even when you don't feel like it, even when you're sad, even when you feel like you don't have anything to offer, even when there's still shame, a seed of shame still in your life, that is when God does the things that he wants to do. And that's when just our faithfulness, it becomes like like the Tasmanian devil, how he starts spinning and then it's like this crazy thing. That's just how I imagine like that. Or like fire. Fire starts small, but then it burns up everything. But the thing about fire is when it burns up things, it destroys things, but also there's room for new growth. And it actually makes the things grow even better than they would have ever before. And so I think that that's kind of just one little step of obedience could make you turn into like the Tasmanian devil in a positive way, where you're just like spinning and it's this crazy thing, or like this ferocious fire that kills all the bad and makes room for new growth. And yeah, I think that that's the easiest way to do it, is just in the small things in the day to day. If the Lord puts on your heart, hey, just smile, get off your phone when you're at the grocery store and going through the cash register and ask the person, how are they really? And wait for a response. I also believe that it always happens in consistency, because God is a God who is consistent. And, what are you doing throughout the day? Because a lot of people think, oh, well, you have these crazy stories because you're always traveling or you live this kind of life and you're a missionary. No, you can have these crazy stories working in corporate America. I know it because I was cleaning houses in America, scrubbing toilets, and God was showing me crazy things. And I saw more miracles happen in America than I did outside of America. But it's because I showed up when I was tired. I showed up when I didn't want to, or when I didn't feel like it, or when I was sad. I showed up when I felt betrayed by people. I still chose to show up. I went to the grocery store this one time when I was really sad. And the Lord's like, it's time to go to the grocery store. And I was like, I don't even want to eat, And he was like, it's time to go to the grocery store. And I was like, okay. So I was pushing my little cart, and I see this old lady in the chip aisle, and she's looking at popcorn. And I love old people, so of course I'm drawn to her, even in my sadness. And she's like, do you know what popcorn is good? And I was like, I can help you choose one. And I end up helping her choose and reach one because she was really short. And I get her some popcorn, and she ends up telling me, my husband died 10 years ago. I have terminal brain cancer. Half of her head was shaved. And she's like, and I just feel alone. Like, I'm 80 years old. I have nothing left to offer. And I, help at the church library, but I don't even think they need me. And I had this moment where I was able to look this woman in the eye and say, you have something to offer, and we're never too old. And she was believing that lie, like, I'm too old to be significant for the kingdom. And I was like, you are needed. Who you are is needed. And I start crying in this aisle in Walmart, and she's crying. And I end up praying for her, and all these people are walking around, and she's like, thank you so much. You don't know how that just made my day. And I continue pushing my shopping cart, sobbing. And the Lord's like, do you see why I asked you to show up today? Because this isn't just about you. This is about other people too. And that completely changed the trajectory of my day and how I felt. And it was that pivot point where I wasn't going to be depressed anymore, because God was using me to do something. Even in my sadness and in my sorrow, he used me. And I was like, dang, what a privilege to be here. So it's little moments like that where I'm really big on showing up, and because that's what it requires. Show up when you're sad. Show up when you don't feel like it. Show up when you don't feel like you're adequate or called or equipped or all of the things. And it's in those moments that when you're obedient with the little things that God trusts you with even more, and just your faithfulness with him, it grows. And then you see those things happening. And then when you have hardships, because we will, it's not rainbows and butterflies. That ain't a cakewalk from here on out. but you stand on that firmer foundation because it's so much more solid when you've already, it's like, dang, I've been here before. Or the Lord's like, remember last time? you also were like, I'm fetal position, I want to die. And he's like, it's time to eat a snack and have a nap. That helped one of my prophets. It's going to help you too. So yeah, I think that's the best advice I could give to somebody. It doesn't have to be this massive thing. It's just like purpose. So many people ask me about purpose. Like, I don't know my purpose. Your purpose, all of our purpose is discipleship. So what does discipleship look like for you? That may be going to the same coffee shop every day and asking the person and cultivating that relationship with the person who's working there, the barista, and getting to know them.
Aubray, thank you so much for sharing your heart today. I feel just by hearing and listening in your story for the first time, you have a genuine heart of hospitality and you care deeply about people and hearing their stories. So thank you. Your heart is so sweet. So I just think, like so many people just want to be heard, and just how you were talking about your house, allowing people to come in and just like sharing love with them is so beautiful. It's really special. So thank you for representing that to people, because in a world that's like super crazy, you get to be that light. So thank you. I loved getting to know Aubray so much. I could have talked to her all day. Some takeaway questions to think or journal about this week after our conversation today is to just have some time to reflect and think about what we talked about. And the first thing was kintsugi. I know I talked about that Japanese art form where there's the pottery and it has these cracks, and usually, a potter would just throw it away. But what they do is they fill in those cracks with gold. How have you seen God fill in those hard spaces? And second, Aubray talked about obedience. And we serve a God who requires obedience. And this is not in some dictatorship way, but because he loves us. He's our Father. He wants what's best for us. So what can you do today to be obedient to him? Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to talk with you, and sometimes it's kind of one-sided. I don't get to see you guys listening, so I'd love to connect. You can follow me over on Instagram or Facebook. There's extra content over there and some behind-the-scenes stuff, things that are happening around our house here with the Zapchenks, things that are helping me grow, different books and other podcasts and other people that I'd love to celebrate and help you learn about. I'd love to connect with you more, so you can find me there at Instagram or Facebook. It's at Danielle Zapchenk. That's Zapchenk. And secondly, rate or review the show. I would appreciate that so much. There's been so much great feedback, and I am so grateful for that. So it really helps people find out about the Parable Podcast, or just tell a friend. I just had a friend the other day tell me that her and her friend talked about the show, and that just meant so much to me, because that is my deepest desire, that people are having conversations, life change is happening. And so I am grateful to hear how this show has impacted you. If you have any questions, or you want more information about today's episode, or you want to meet Aubray, you can find them over at daniellezapchenk.com. That is going to do it for today. Thank you for spending time with me. Remember, your parable showcases the beauty of obedience to him. I'm going to see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.